Your burger is served. And this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
This episode is brought to you by Max. The HBO original comedy special, Gerard Carmichael, Don't Be Gay, is now streaming on Max. Emmy-winning comedian Gerard Carmichael returns to the stage in his boldest special yet, bringing his sharp wit, unfiltered honesty, and the kind of vulnerability that's made his voice truly one of a kind. Don't miss Gerard Carmichael, Don't Be Gay. Now streaming on Max.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my fellow Democrat, University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes, as well as a new conservative voice on the show, Cincinnati area attorney Joey Ashbrook. Justin and Joey, welcome.
Thanks. Good morning, Mike. Great to be with you.
And before we move along any further, folks know Justin certainly, but Joey, you are, as I said, a new voice. And so can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I am a local boy born in Hamilton, raised in the Cincinnati area, and I am a conservative Republican who's involved in the conservative legal movement. I'm the president of our local chapter of the Federalist Society, and a few years ago founded a conservative legal boutique that, among other things, enables us to fight the fights we care about and engage in conservative side public interest litigation. So really looking forward to the exchange of ideas.
Before we get to the various things we want to talk about this week, I do want to thank a few new supporters. Matthew, who's a new free trial supporter on Patreon, which is a thing you can do. I'm certainly a fan of free trials. As well as Jennifer, who's a new monthly supporter through PayPal, which is another thing you can do. And of course, it's supporters that make the Politics Guys possible. So thank you, Jennifer, Matthew. And as always, you can find support links in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And one final thing, folks, last week, I mentioned that I've been trying Magic Mind as a possible alternative to the coffee I drink every morning. And it typically leaves me sort of jittery until I get that crash in the early afternoon. And as I mentioned last week, my initial results were encouraging. I drank it instead of that second cup of coffee. I noticed what felt like a clear difference. I got that boost without all that jitteriness and no actual crash. But hey, I'm a scientist. I mean, a social scientist, but okay. I felt I should run a little N of 1 experiment. So I went back to my traditional second cup for a few days this week. And well, same story, edgy energy, big crash. So now I'm back drinking Magic Mind. They call it a mental performance elixir. And honestly, that pretty much fits with my experience of it. I don't know what it is, a lion's mane, matcha, ashwagandha, other stuff they have in there, but probably some combination. But for me, I can say it's good stuff. And so I can absolutely recommend Magic Mind. And they are, in fact, so confident in their product that if you're not happy, they give you 100 days to ask for a full refund. No questions asked, even if you drank the shots. And better yet, you can get 50% off your first Magic Mind subscription by going to magicmind.com/politicsguys50. That's magicmind.com/politicsguys50. And if you forget that URL, God knows I would, you can just click on it in today's show notes. All right. So, Justin, do you want to get us started off this morning?
Sure. So we have kind of this ongoing Israel thing that I feel like we come back to every time I'm on, more or less, and probably in perpetuity. But sort of a real ramping up this week in terms of kind of the scope of the conflict. Basically, Israel has dropped a series of bombs on Iran. Iran has sort of tried to counter. And the justification seems to be on Israel's part concerns about, threats of Iran developing nuclear weapons, which has been sort of an ongoing concern. So we've had, kind of the Obama administration, we had an agreement with them to allow inspections and limit or end a nuclear program. Trump pretty much undid that, tried to negotiate a new deal, didn't get it. Biden administration tried to negotiate a new deal and was sort of shot down in the last minute. And there is this sort of open question here about, how much of a threat this is. As a regime, Iran is problematic to say the least. On the other hand, there seems to be a dispute within the intelligence community about how close they actually are to producing a nuclear weapon, which would be sort of a game changer in the region. As far as sort of results, Israel seems to be sort of having the upper hand here, both with sort of their missile defense and perhaps better targeting. They've taken out several Iranian military leaders as well as some civilians. And the question sort of is what comes next? So there are sort of some negotiations happening in the EU, which don't seem to be going anywhere. And Trump at this point has gone from kind of a sort of interventionist stance to saying that he'll reach a decision in about 2 weeks about what to do. That 2 weeks thing seems to be a thing for him with some regularity. So that kind of lays out the kind of lay of the land as far as that situation goes. Mike, what do you think is going to happen here? Gosh, that's an awful question. But how do we solve this? Now, I don't know, thoughts, prayers, have at it.
Wow. There's obviously a lot here. And I guess where I want to kind of start is in that American politics framework. And I'm thinking about Tulsi Gabbard. Maybe I'm thinking about her more because at one point she was a guest on the show. I don't know. But talk about getting thrown under the bus. I mean, she appears before a congressional committee and testifies that, no, Iran's not actively working on a bomb at this point. And then Donald Trump says, I don't care what she said. I think they were very close to having one. And I guess to me, the first question is, well, okay, if your director of national intelligence says that it is the best estimate of the entire U.S. intelligence community that Iran, in fact, is not working on a bomb, then if you're taking Israel's word over your own intelligence community's word, well, that would suggest to me that you don't have a lot of faith in that community. And as such, then maybe you should do something about that. So I don't know. But I guess that gets into the bigger sort of MAGA rift on this, because Gabbard certainly represents part of the no foreign entanglements wing of MAGA. And as our resident conservative today, Joy, I'm kind of curious how you see that kind of, it's not exactly a split, I'll say, but it certainly is. There certainly are some differences of opinion there. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there are differences of opinion, but I think a lot of the Gabbard dynamic, a lot of it's in semantics. I do think her comments are taken out of context for purposes of highlighting a split. And I think in a lot of ways, our politics is too sophisticated for our own good. But from an Iran standpoint, there is always within the MAGA movement, I think there are always going to be splits of shades of degree of how much of interventionalism, as little of it as possible versus isolationist. And very few people are truly isolationist and very few people are truly interventionalist. And it's complicated. So the semantics part that I think is important to understand in this context is that working on a bomb, you can enrich uranium above a certain level that has no civilian peaceful use whatsoever. The only thing that you would do with it is militaristic weaponization. Iran has enriched uranium past the point where there is any possible civilian use for it. Now, there are multiple stages to making a nuclear weapon, including you have to develop the physical bomb that the uranium goes in, and then you have to condense the bomb to a certain size that you can stick it on a warhead and deliver it. So the semantic dynamic that's really going on right now among folks talking and arguing is their enrichment capability is beyond the limit of what is useful to use in peaceful situations. But the intelligence community maybe disagree over whether or not they have built the bomb housing that maybe, I don't know, initially talking heads and folks have been talking about this and have been saying it would be about the size of a car and then you have to condense it. Have they taken the steps for the warhead development? But that doesn't take that long to do. So the president, since, 2016, this isn't a new thing for him, has been saying, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And he's been very consistent on that. And the idea that they have enriched uranium from the point of past civilian peaceful usage, that there's no peaceful usage for it whatsoever, is very reasonable to say they are developing a weapon. And then people can semantically argue about how much are they developing the weapon. But I personally think that Trump's position is the right one, and that he is about as deftly balancing peace and strength as much as most Americans in their heart of hearts would say, I want my president to behave like that. I want him to be strong, but I want him to be a peacemaker if we can find it. I don't want him wasting American lives, but I don't want him to let our adversaries threaten us and our allies with something cataclysmic that could change the entire world for the worse. So I think that it does create real dynamics, but I think a lot of the dynamics is more of our human nature is to disagree. And there's always going to be a split for people that are shades of isolationist or interventionalist. But I think semantics are an important overlay for what's really going on.
Justin, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal that President Trump pulled out of, and then the Biden administration. Honestly, I don't know if they worked that hard to get back into it exactly, but I think one argument that I've heard on the left certainly is that, well, if he hadn't done that, we'd be in a much better position to actually assess where Iran was at this. And so we can kind of put a lot of this, in fact, on President Trump's doorstep. And I wanted to get your take on that and maybe Joey's reaction.
I had highlighted a little history in the intro to kind of to prime you to talk about that, I suppose. But yeah, the deal maybe wasn't perfect, certainly under, that we had before, but Trump basically ripped it up with nothing in place to replace it. And, I think that's a problem, and again, I think, Iran itself is a bigger problem. I mean, it's, they clearly have some aspirations here. But there was something that was doing a reasonably good job of having inspections and placing limits, et cetera. And so that really kind of just sets all of this in motion. At that point, we have very little recourse in terms of, heading off something before it comes to a military situation like we're sitting on now. And I think that was probably a mistake. My understanding is with Biden, they were fairly close, and then essentially kind of the supreme leader said no and walked away at the last minute, but they had negotiated, some version of an inspections regime and limits on enrichment, et cetera. So, I mean, I think that sets the ball in motion. The problem then becomes, how do we deal with now? Because it is sort of a new set of facts on the ground. And, I think Trump is kind of all over the place on this. One, he's doing a lot of this on Truth Social, where he's just sort of sending messages out into the world that I don't know is a particularly useful tactic in dealing with, potential nuclear conflict. But beyond that, this really feels like a moment where, he's ceded a lot to other countries. I mean, this feels like, there are not active U.S. negotiations right now. It's happening kind of in the EU. That's not going anywhere. But it really seems to be sort of a pullback from showing leadership on this. Now, certainly it's possible that and likely that the administration is working behind the scenes on some things. But this sort of 2-week punt, just sort of lets the situation go. And he really framed it as, in terms of talking about kind of not much incentive to negotiate, that, well, Israel's winning. They're not going to want to negotiate. And it seems like so long as they have the upper hand, he's not that interested in negotiating a solution either.
Well, on the original deal, I guess it depends on the one that the Obama administration did. I guess it depends on what you think about the deal. And in Trump language, he'd probably say it was a fake deal. That if you allow someone to engage in a way that the practical reality is once they get to a certain point with a matter of weeks or months, off the grid, they could develop a weapon. You've essentially allowed them to maintain the mechanics to achieve the result. So when he says we're not going to let them enrich uranium, what I hear the president saying is, we're not going to let them do the one thing that they need to do to actually get it done. And we're not going to be in a position where they're going to be able to say, surprise, we outsmarted you. So if you do think it wasn't a good deal or it was a fake deal, then he's not really giving anything up by stepping out of it. And then the only real question in life, diplomacy is incredibly important, but at some point you can't force people to do something unless you force them to do it. So I think that it's really dumb from the Iranians now they have their own internal political calculus and dynamics that they have to think about, and that's real. I tend to think that the smart move here for the Iranian leadership would be make a trade for their enrichment program for massive economic vitality in the region, and to try to put yourself at the center of that, a re-energizing of the Middle East, whereas some of their other countries, the Qatars of the world, the UAEs, are leading in that. I think the smartest thing to do is to try to use this as a pivot to try to make yourself a leader in that. But pride is a terribly difficult thing. And I don't know at the end of the day if they're going to do the reasonable thing. And I read Trump giving the space of a couple weeks to give any opportunity possible for something short of using American bombs or American planes to destroy the nuclear facility at Fordo. That's what I read it to be. He may not have a choice, but he's at least trying.
Well, yeah, it occurs to me that there's one way of looking at this in which it might be a little harsh to say that President Trump was played exactly, but you could argue that Netanyahu cleverly maneuvered the U.S. And here's my argument, is that certainly Israel is very sensitive to potential intelligence failures after it totally missed those brutal and horrific Hamas attacks. And so if they had even any sort of inkling that there was some kind of a movement, I can understand why they might just want to go ahead and go in there. But once they do make that first move and attack, then that basically tells Iran, well, we better develop a bomb as quickly as possible, because clearly Israel has no compunction about just doing whatever to us. And that brings the U.S. into that as well, because, you mentioned the Fordo facility. And of course, one of the wrinkles, it's more than a wrinkle in this, is that for that facility to go down, it will require not just U.S. ordnance, but a U.S. pilot flying a U.S. plane, because the only aircraft that's capable of deploying that GBU-57 bunker buster that you need for Fordo is, in fact, the B-2 stealth bomber, and that's U.S. only. So it seems to me that you could look at this as Netanyahu very smartly sort of maneuvering, working things out so that the U.S. kind of has to commit. Because at this point, if we just sort of pull back in any way, I don't really see there being any incentive for Iran not to say, well, we can't let this happen again. We better develop a bomb because this is not okay. I don't know. That's sort of my take on it. Justin, what do you think?
Well, and I think I agree with a lot of that. I'd actually take the history a little further back, too, in terms of motivations. I'm going to put a disclaimer on here, right up front, which is that I don't think Iran having a nuclear weapon is a good thing.
No.
To be clear. And, I think they're a generally pretty lousy regime. That said, I think the other motivation here is that, the U.S. and Israel and others have been talking regime change with them for decades. And so, kind of in terms of their perception of this, this, along with kind of the current situation, would seem to justify in their mind, developing the weapons. And, I think it also, I agree with Joey that, this plays to some internal politics as well. But that I think is ultimately the kind of big question here is, if the U.S. is going to, we've been hands off up to this point, or, at least, apart from, sort of supplying some weapons. But, you're absolutely right. I mean, this kind of the end game of this potentially would be the U.S. dropping a bomb on Iran. And that's a big thing, and I think, conceivably justified under some situations, I suppose. But I think it has, real potential to be sort of destabilizing, within the region and sort of pulling us back, into kind of more conflict there.
Yeah. Joey, I wanted to ask you, because it seems to me that Israel will not consider itself successful unless it has put that Fordo facility out of commission, and that can't be done without U.S. help. And so even if that 2-week period, that would either mean, I guess, Iran's unconditional surrender, as President Trump put it, which I don't see happening. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that the president should authorize a U.S. aircraft and U.S. pilot to go fly over Iran and drop one of those bombs on that facility?
Yeah, it's in the wake of the Iraq history. It's a really hard dynamic. I do think, though, if there's ever been a U.S. president in a moment that I trust to balance all the dynamics that you have talked about, including the Israel piece, and, is there a dynamic? Of course, Israel has its own agenda and interests, just like the United States does. His makeup is he has really good human instincts and a really strong desire to not be boxed into anybody else's view of convention. That's his whole ethos, that I think he will, as good as anybody can, intuit and look at all of the information and say what is in the best interest of America, and do it and not look back, whether it's making a peace deal that's got economic benefits to Iran related to it, or whether it's authorizing an intelligent use of military force related to the U.S. capabilities to achieve the objective, without allowing that to spiral as much as humanly possible into something greater. He's got the right collection in his own personal makeup and in his politics that actually makes him uniquely suited as an American president for this moment.
Interesting. I wouldn't agree with that, but I see where you're coming from. I can kind of follow that. It occurs to me also that we've talked about internal domestic politics, and I think we've focused more a little bit on Iran, but there's also the Israel domestic politics aspect of it, because, I mean, some folks might say, is this sort of a wag the dog moment, if you will, for Netanyahu? Because, of course, 2 days before those first Israeli attacks, Netanyahu's government survived by not a big margin, a vote to actually dissolve the Israeli parliament. And some polling at least, suggested his coalition wouldn't win if there are new elections. And he's, as many folks know, he's actually in believe it or not, the 5th year of his trial for 3 separate cases involving bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, I believe. And so you can make the argument that, well, this is this warlike footing, sort of like with Putin in Russia. This is the sort of thing that brings Israelis together and keeps Netanyahu in power and out of jail. And maybe Donald Trump has a little bit of sympathy for an embattled leader of a country who's facing corruption charges or, accusations of corruption. And I don't know. I feel like there might be something there. Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I've certainly seen this. And Netanyahu, I mean, he's been in and out of power, a couple times. And I think he has a fairly tenuous sort of hold on holding office. So I don't think it's entirely implausible that that's at least part of the motivation. I think beyond that, it maybe shifts attention a little bit, so kind of apart from kind of the dynamics of whatever kind of internal political trouble he might be in. There has been quite a bit of foreign backlash as far as how Israel is dealing with the Palestinians. And by shifting here to sort of a new target, that kind of, it reframes the conflict a little bit. Nobody seems to like Iran very much. And so it is potentially a way to kind of gain some sympathy, I think, both sort of at home, hey, look, this is more conflict. We need to put domestic politics aside and everybody needs to support this strong leader. But also, I think, a way of perhaps shifting sort of global opinion back around, towards Israel. There was some talk that now I haven't heard anything about, of several European countries actually recognizing Palestine as a state. I don't hear any of that talk this week, at all. And so I think that may be, again, not setting aside the reality of, there's uranium involved here. But I think these are sort of additional things that might be sort of pushing down that road, is that, there are some real political benefits here for Israel by sort of expanding the conflict in that way.
Yeah. So I guess what we know is that Donald Trump has very clearly said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And so given that, and given the fact that it seems, if I understand the situation correctly, God knows, but that the Fordo facility is critical to them having one, or the ability to quickly develop one or not, that seems to me to mean that, well, either we are involved in this in a very direct way to ensure that Iran will, in fact, not have a nuclear weapon, or we won't. So the question becomes, I guess, to put it kind of bluntly, will President Trump taco on this, or will he follow through on this? And will we, in fact, 2 weeks or a month from now, be in a situation where Iran will not be able to have a nuclear weapon because we have bombed that Fordo facility? What do you think, Joey?
There's no way to know, but I think if it's really a question of their ability to have a nuclear weapon versus not, I think that we will allow U.S. assets to take out that facility without spiraling. Another way of thinking about it is, we're talking about, you don't have to put boots on the ground to do the job of the significant degradation of the facility. From the Democratic perspective, what's possible is using what Biden termed over the horizon capabilities when he left Afghanistan. That was his foreign policy view, was we're going to get the boots out of the ground of Afghanistan, which I think was extremely poorly managed, which is probably no surprise. That's my view.
No, me too.
But that's what Trump, if Trump does something, I think Trump would use our extended capabilities without allowing us to be enmeshed in boots on the ground involvement and regime change and nation building. And it's not impossible that Israel also has other potential means in the event that the U.S. does not, including, although it would be really messy and it's risky, some boots on the ground special forces attempt to knock out the Fordo facility itself. But I think even with their smaller ordnance capabilities, they could do certain things with it, such as entombing it as opposed to blowing it up, even if their stuff doesn't penetrate as far. But I think if you're going to do it, you better make darn sure you're effective with it, or else it's the only thing dumber than not solving the problem is partially solving the problem and perpetuating the problem. And we're in the same place 8 years from now with people who hate us even more and having a greater rallying cry. And I think the president understands all that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Justin, any other final thoughts on Israel and Iran?
No, I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this the next time I'm on.
You think? It's not going anywhere, certainly. Yeah, well, we will.
And sometime in 2035 as well.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla Al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla Al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Well, we will leave that there for now and move on to domestic politics. Last Saturday, June 14th, Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hordman was shot to death along with her husband, Mark. And earlier that day, State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were shot in their home, and thankfully both of them survived. After the most extensive manhunt in Minnesota history, authorities captured Vance Bolter and charged him with murder, stalking, and firearms violations. Now, Bolter had reportedly gone to two other state legislators' homes that morning intending to kill them. And when he was apprehended, they found what appears to be a kill list of over 45 elected officials, all Democrats. President Trump said that the horrific violence will not be tolerated, and Attorney General Pam Bondi promised that the case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. However, the president decided not to call Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, as is sort of customary in these situations. He told reporters, "I think the governor of Minnesota is so whacked out, I'm not calling him." And he continued, "So I could be nice and call him, but why waste time?" Now, Utah's Republican Senator Mike Lee, I don't know if he saw that and said, "Hold my beer" or something, but he responded by tweeting a picture of Bolter with the caption, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way." And then, I guess feeling he hadn't inflamed things enough, tweeted the same picture with the caption, "Nightmare on Wall Street." Now, Lee wasn't the only Republican U.S. Senator who attempted to, I would say, spread misinformation about the assassinations. My very own state, Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, tweeted, "The degree to which the extreme left has become radical, violent, and intolerant is both stunning and terrifying." So, guys, I don't know if there's a lot to say about what Bolter did. Certainly, we agree with the president. That's appalling, and he was right to call it horrific violence, and it shouldn't be tolerated. But I thought we could start with President Trump's, comments about Walz, as well as what Senators Lee and Moreno posted on their, I should point out, their personal X accounts. Joey, you're a Republican voice here today, and Bernie Moreno is your senator, just like he's mine. So why don't we start with you on this?
I think, Mike, I think this issue is from the inner domestic politics is a nothing burger issue, just because everybody correctly condemns the violence, which is right and correct. Leader Thune did it. Speaker Johnson did it. As you correctly mentioned, the president did it. I'll address both the tweets and then the political dynamic of the president and Governor Walz in Minnesota. On the tweets, I don't think it was Mike Lee's best moment. I think he'd probably want it back if he could do it over again. And in the world of our news cycle's changing so fast. Okay, things are happening so fast with the war going on with with Iran and Israel, with the domestic stuff. There's just so much happening and our news cycles are going so fast. And to err is human. And I think people in this particular instance jumped the gun on what they viewed the motivations for this particular horrific, indefensible act was. And I think they probably would want it back. I know I'm a Bernie Moreno fan. I think he's doing a great job and he's a patriot. And I think that his statement about his concern about political violence is accurate. But I don't obviously in this case, it does not appear to be an instance of Mangione part deux. It appears to be something else. And I think that the greater concern for all of us is in our politics, the extent to which we can disagree vigorously and promote civics and disagree without being disagreeable and build in a culture of who we are founded to be as Americans. I think it's in all of our interests because global politics is getting more sophisticated in its ability to influence American politics. And we have a lot of enemies that would love nothing more than Americans to come unhinged and destroy ourselves from the inside. And so I think that it's wise for all of us to be circumspect about these things and correctly condemn, as Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, and the president did. On the president's not calling Governor Walz, I chalk this up to the president's non-convention, and I think he would see it as a non-meaningful political gesture, and he spent his political life eschewing what he would call meaningless gestures. I think in the scheme, though, of just pure political symmetry, I think that it worked that Vice President Vance called Walz. I think most Americans remember the debate that they had that had a tenor to it that was reminiscent of debates in days gone by in certain seasons of our American political history. So I think that was a nice symmetry. I doubt that Governor Walz called President Trump personally after the assassination attempts with President Trump. So it's not a dynamic that bothers me, but I do think that folks were correct to condemn it. And I do think, like, for Senator Lee, I think that's certainly a tweet he would want back. And I chalk it up to human error in a world of really fast news cycles. And it's a good reminder to everybody to act with some modicum of restraint before they post stuff online. Like my mama would tell me.
Yeah, well, as I've said many times before, I feel like X brings out the dumbest and angriest version, pretty much all of us. But
yeah, 100%. You're right.
Justin, what do you think?
So remind me, what are the language standards for this podcast where we keep the?
I think we're technically listed as clean. Now, when we go to the midweek episode, then I don't think there's a listing on that after the first 15 minutes or so. But yeah, if you'll be dropping F-bombs, left and right, it might be.
we won't go that far, but. I think I have a bit of a different take a little bit on some of the response. And to my mind, a lot of this feels like flooding the zone with bullshit. That was the word I was,
I think we're good with that.
We're good with bullshit?
Yeah. Fabulous. God, I hope we are. You can't say bullshit.
I am.
You have, in my personal life, that you have no idea how hard I have to work to keep it clean on here. So yeah, it's anyway. Thank you for the release valve. At any rate, I feel like we've seen this, multiple times now. The Paul Pelosi attack, is reminiscent of this in a lot of ways, both in terms of kind of an attempt of political violence on an elected official from the other party, but also the response where. There is all of this kind of rumor mongering, out there and, it's his gay lover and, things like that. And this feels a lot the same. You've got Republicans sort of bending over backwards in Mike Lee and some others. And, having a Minnesota connection, I follow a lot of Minnesota news sources. And, in the comments, you're sort of seeing this as well, is that, this is, it's Murderapolis again. And, this is Tim Walz being soft on crime and this conspiracy theory, out there that he's somehow part of the No Kings rallies or something like that. And, I'm not sure that I'm willing to sort of give a pass on this. There was a lot of effort kind of amongst rank and file people, but I think sort of enabled from the top to essentially try to totally flip the narrative on this. There's also kind of this early discussion that, clearly he was put up to it because these were the two members of the legislature that voted to end certain assistance to illegal immigrants. And so, clearly that's what's going on. And, the more we see about this guy, that's clearly not what's going on. It's largely, he's fervently pro-life and all the targets were various pro-choice people. But it seems like there's this attempt to, if not convince people, at least muddy the waters to the point where nobody's willing to believe anything. And so, I don't know that, I don't know that it's a concerted effort necessarily. It may be sort of a psychological reflex, but that stuff's out there. And now it's sort of percolating in the public and whatnot. And people can just throw up their hands and say, well, who really knows what his motivation is? Despite that we have got a pretty good sense of what his motivation is. As far as Trump not calling, I think it's classless. And I think, Trump does a really generally poor job at a lot of the sort of unifying symbolic president kind of stuff that we expect, that sort of public face of the nation, public leadership kinds of things. This is the kind of thing that should get a call from the president instead of an insult. I think that's just frankly reprehensible, and it fits a pattern with him. Look at like every holiday greeting, that he puts out on Twitter and Truth. He can't celebrate Easter without insulting liberals, and I just think, I'm totally with Joey here about unifying and trying to get along and whatnot. But, some of that starts at the top. And he's really done. It's just everything is an insult. Everything is enemies. There is no reaching across to do even the most basic things that we would expect a president to do in a situation like this. And yeah, I'm going to stop.
Okay. Well, I do have to say, on those messages, I don't know about you guys, but I'm almost at the point where I'm kind of enjoying the president's holiday tweets or truths. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. The president's holiday truths, because they always are like, and I hope everyone has a happy holiday and you have a good time, including those soulless, scummy individuals who hate America and are Democrats. I don't know. It's to the point where it's almost like a parody, sort of. But it's just. But go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, Mike. I think that but that's in my own personal. That's an interesting observation. I think that he just defies convention in every way, in a way that. There's some things that, nobody agrees with anybody about 100% of anything. And it's easy to find things about Trump that maybe you personally would do different. But his total package that I've come to really, really like as an American citizen, part of it is a rejection of convention. And I think he would say that unity, that within the context of what's really going on in our country and in the dynamic of the personalities, it would be fake unity. And I think as a nation, we all have room to think about how do we move from fake unity, fake political, this is the thing you're supposed to say, versus what is the thing as human beings we need to do to look after each other. And I think that I don't know that it's going to be, honestly, in the current political climate during his second term that happens. But I think for all of us, that's important as Americans, and that he is an important catalyst for what is ultimately healthy progress for the country because of his constant refusal to be the pool boy to barren political convention when there's real substance the country needs to move forward.
Interesting. Yeah. And when I pull back and think about not just this incident, but the overall picture, it's pretty concerning. For instance, in 2024, the Capitol Police recorded over 9,400 what they call concerning statements and direct threats against members of Congress, which also includes their family, immediate family and staff. And that's an 18%, more than an 18% increase from the year before. And it's a 140% increase from 2017, which is the earliest year for which I could find the Capitol Police's data on that. And so, I mean, this is not just, a thing that happened, but it's part of a larger trend of folks not just being acrimonious, but threatening, in many cases, in some cases, at least actually perpetrating political violence. And I think this is awful, certainly, and we would all agree that it's awful. But if we pull back historically, what we find is that it's not exactly uncommon, because we've actually had worse political violence in at least two previous periods. And I don't mean the Civil War. A lot of people forget about that, the late 19-teens and the early 20s. It was World War I. Should we enter into that? The whole industrialization, tensions between, labor and capital. Socialist movement was big in the United States. And then, of course, in the 60s and early 70s, in fact, that period was, wow, talk about mega violent. There was an 18-month period between 1971 and 1972. The FBI reported, I kid you not, 2,500 bombings on American soil. That's an average of around 5 per day. So we've seen this before, but what makes this different is that most of those attacks, if you look at the 1960s, they were done by groups like the Weather Underground and other usually radical left groups in that era. But now most of this is happening from individuals, which makes it a lot trickier, because a big part of the reason why those groups their impact was minimized or they were stopped is that the FBI and law enforcement did a really good job of infiltrating into those groups and breaking them up. But now when you have like this guy, this Bolter guy, there's nothing to infiltrate. It's just some guy who probably got radicalized from social media and whatnot. And it seems to me that while we're not at the level of overall violence that we saw in the late 60s, early 70s, it's in some ways, it feels to me like a more intractable problem. I don't know. What do you think? Either of you guys, I don't know. We can start with you, Joey, on that, or Justin. I think I heard you start. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think this kind of lone wolf stuff is really concerning, and certainly one concern that I would have is that you get copycats after this. I mean, now that he's hopefully people are more on guard, but he's sort of laid the blueprint for how you can do this and get away with it. Well, not get away with it for a couple days. But I do worry, exactly like you said, from everything that I've seen about this guy, nobody knew, I don't think. His wife maybe had an inkling, but really nobody else. He hadn't, spilled the beans to anyone that's come forward. And that's, I think, like you said, with the group-based stuff, you can kind of infiltrate, you can break up. The more people know, the more people talk, et cetera. But, this guy, I just was looking at the results of the search of his house the other day, and, a weird guy, but, he's got, just a mountain of guns, mountain of ammunition, owns a cop car, more or less, and yet can basically keep this, under the radar enough. And so, my concern is, are there more people like him out there? And they don't have to be networked anymore. It's a little reminiscent of, in some ways, say the Boston Marathon bombing, where, those guys weren't part of any particular group. They sort of, radicalized themselves. And I think you're right. I mean, this is the sort of thing that's really, really hard to defend against. And, the difficulty here is that, there is not a lot of security for most elected officials. The president obviously has a lot. Governors have a lot. State legislators have none, which is, as we see here. But even members of Congress don't have very much. I was at a thing in D.C. with retired members of Congress a while ago, and they were complaining about, kind of during their time in office, that they did feel in many cases not very secure because, outside of, while they're at work, obviously there's security, but outside of that, not really. And so, I have real concerns that there are a lot of soft targets here, and that we might sort of get into some copycat situations.
Yeah. Joey, what do you think?
It's awful. It's awful. Our local elected officials and our congressmen and congresswomen, state legislators don't need to be looking over their shoulder, wondering if someone's going to try to pick them off because they disagree. It's already hard enough for them to have half the population start with the presumption that they're just awful people, just in the nature of our hyper-pitched, divisive politics at the moment. But it's really it's a scary problem. It's a real problem, and I think that we all need to be circumspect and think about our civics culture and how we're continuing to and how we make efforts to try to build real unity more than fake unity, and what principles are those circled around and built around, rather than just playing a hyper sophisticated game of politics while our underlying structure rots. And so if you think about what I don't think is going to happen in the situation with this gentleman in Minnesota, I don't think he's going to get a musical made about his life like Mangione. I personally have more concern about systemized violence coming from the left than the right, because of my concern that to your observation about that it's less about individual groups like the Weather Underground, and now it's more individuals. Traditionalist, leftist, political, historical thought comes with violence as the means of effectuating your policy preference and a glorification of that. So I think if you look at what our global enemies would love nothing more to do, then would be like you think about the Mossad in Iran and how effective they were at getting at getting Iranians and intelligence assets in Iran to be effective in helping them achieve their military objectives, we're dumb to not think our enemies abroad are doing the exact same thing and would try to do the exact same thing in America. And I'm concerned about the current trajectory of the Democrat Party, that it used to be the party of LBJ, and in response to a bad election, McGovern gets the nod and Bill Clinton could get the nomination and win the White House. So now those leftist impulses are stronger and controlling, and it makes it harder to condemn certain things in the same way that I think makes us more susceptible to malignant influences and enemies outside of our country to try to fuel that and actually turn ourselves against ourselves and help us self-destruct from the inside. I have a genuine concern about that. And from the right, I think if it's someone from the right that does something like that, it's wrong. It doesn't matter who it is or who goes to someone's house and shoots them because they disagree with their politics. That's wrong. And it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. And America has shown that there is a better way, that the entire American system is a better way. And as Americans, as we work on and coming up to the 250th anniversary of our nation and the better angels of our nature, and we renewing American values, need to remind ourselves of who we are and that we have a better way, and to not back down from that and just keep doing the daily grassroots work of trying to build a better world with our neighbors.
I'm certainly for that. And I certainly agree with you that if you look at a lot of radical left thinking, it is revolutionary and violent. Just like if you look at just radical thinking in general, whether it's left or right, you'll see those very troubling elements. And, when you mentioned earlier about President Trump's disdain for fake and false contention, I thought it was a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it in quite the way you put it, but I also think you can make an argument like a lot of us on the left would make, is that you can do that sort of thing without, for instance, regularly referring to the governor of California as new scum and using this sort of language that basically constantly belittles and dehumanizes women. And I think a lot of us on the left feels like if that comes from the top, that's sort of a signal to say, you know what? These people are really less than human. And so if we do want to do the work of coming together and creating not fake unity, which I agree kind of pointless, could even be worse than real unity, well, we would expect some sort of leadership from the top on that. And it's one thing to not engage in false, fake, empty gestures, but it's another thing to go out of your way to mock and belittle people. And so I think that's an important distinction.
With the caveat of that, I think that observation is incredibly complicated in this context, because there's never been an American politician, whether you believe justifiable or not, there's never been an American politician in my lifetime that received the same level of animalistic dehumanization and delegitimization as President Trump, going back to his win in 2016, that essentially no one has ever given him, no one from the opposite side, or very few people from the opposite side, have given him the respect of winning and of being able to be the president and be the person who does what he says he's going to do because the people voted for it. And the way that tactically has taken place is to dehumanize and delegitimize him, which probably helped fuel both of the assassination attempts on him, but also makes it hard for him to actually govern, including. So we'll talk about, I think later in the show, we're going to talk about the Ninth Circuit and the National Guard and the dynamic related to that, and the federal district courts issuing injunctions for actions taken by his administration. It is empirically correct that it happens a lot more than for any other president, but it's because there's a cultural gradient that's being sowed to signal and tell everybody it's okay to treat this guy as a different kind of president than someone else. But when I was raised, and I grew up in my family in the living room, we talked about how great our family was and how great Ronald Reagan was. That's the way I grew up. But when Bill Clinton won election, his first time, I was in school and we were watching the inauguration. And I was in a school where most of the kids grew up like me and they were conservative. And when he got up, I booed. And my teacher ripped me a new one. And you know what? She was right. So I think my point is, I understand your point. He's his own man. He's certainly not going to listen to say, hey, you should do things the way Joey thinks you should do them. And I think that's part of his charm. But my point is that I think is right, is that's an exceedingly complicated dynamic. And what I wish for our country is that folks on the other side, a lot of them would say, well, he's probably not going to run again. So this is his last term, and then start to see the good parts about him. And we just stop fighting each other about everything. But I'm not overly optimistic that's going to happen. My point is, it's just exceedingly complicated.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Justin, what do you think?
I think I'm good.
So, yeah, I guess the one thing we all agree on is this was a horrific act of violence that also that it's not this certainly in terms of what he planned on doing was maybe different from some of these other things. But I don't feel like we've seen the last of this sort of thing. And until there are certain broader changes in society, I guess to me, it feels like what drives this more than anything else is kind of a breakdown in real sociability, and that we have so many loners now who are able to, right? The great thing about the online world is you connect with all sorts of people who see the world the same way you do. And in a lot of ways that can be awesome. Justin, you and I don't know if this is awesome, but we both love wristwatches, and we can find other enthusiasts. And actually that's probably not awesome for our bank accounts, but it's kind of a cool thing. But when the thing you connect about is, well, hatred of the other side and how to take them down, all of a sudden then, I mean, in a previous era, I feel like these folks like Bolter wouldn't have been able to make some of these connections, and it would have been harder for them to become radicalized. But it's not like that technology genie is going back in the bottle. So honestly, I don't really feel – I agree with you, Joey, about the sort of things that we would need to do for this to change. I am not feeling – I'm not only not feeling super optimistic, I'm feeling pretty pessimistic about this. I don't know. Is anyone feeling more optimistic than me here?
It's a great observation, Mike. Your observation about the breakdown of socialization, I think, is a very accurate observation of part of what contributes to the creating greater opportunity for it. You're 100% right. I'm optimistic in the sense that at almost every turn for the last 250 years, America has defied what seems to be what should happen. So in that sense, I'm eternally optimistic about Americans, but it's going to take everybody exercising a little humility and trying to step outside of all of our current loggerheads of convention.
Yeah. How about you, Justin? Are you any more optimistic than I am? It's a low bar, I got to say.
Nope. Not at all.
Okay. Well, on that note, we do have a lot more we want to talk about. We want to get into that Tennessee transgender restriction ruling from the Supreme Court. Talk a little bit about tanks in the streets of Washington, D.C. and no Kings rallies, and that Ninth Circuit, Joe, you mentioned that Ninth Circuit ruling on federalizing the California National Guard. But we are just about at the end of our time here for the regular show, so we're going to move all of that to the midweek bonus episode, and we hope you will check that out. If you are not a supporter, well, you can still get the first 10 or 15 minutes. But if you want to get the whole thing, we hope you'll consider becoming a supporter. It's really easy to do. I always put the support links in the show notes. You get that. You get access to the Discord where there are all kinds of conversations and interesting things going on all the time. And we hope you consider that. And as well as if you aren't able to afford to give us anything to support us, hey, we get that. Some of us have been in some pretty serious financial situations. Let me know. I'm happy to set you up with the full midweek episode every single week. And also, before we go, I wanted to mention one final time, if you want to get that 50% off your initial Magic Mind subscription, just go to magicmind.com/politicsguys50. Again, that is in the show notes as well. And finally, before I go, As always, before I go, we're all going actually, as far as I know. A special thanks to our fantastic executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,